Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here. And of course, it is the Israel-Iran war that we are talking about. The big news today reporting that the Iranians are urgently seeking to engage in negotiations and a ceasefire. And why wouldn't they? They have virtually no capacity to strike back against Israel or the Americans. We've seen in the last several days Iran go through about 20% of their total ballistic missile stocks, maybe 5% of them able to get through to hit targets in Israel. Israelis have very robust capacity to defend themselves, also bomb shelters, which means that the Iranians can't hit Israeli military leadership and can't do much damage to Israel's military capabilities and infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Israelis have blown up much of Iran's military leadership, military infrastructure, and with the exception, critically, of the deep underground nuclear site at Fordow, have also been able to blow up a lot of their nuclear capabilities. So at this point, if the Iranians want their regime to emerge from all of this intact, it would be much better for them if they were able to get the Israelis to stop. Again, they've had a couple dozen, maybe 3 dozen Israelis killed and more than that casualties, which is, of course, news. And a problem, but nothing a rounding error compared to the name of the Iranians that are getting killed, and that as the war would continue, would likely become only more lopsided in Israel's favor, especially as they have complete operational dominance in the air above Iran. Meanwhile, almost no one is supporting the Iranians. They have a lot of countries are willing to condemn the attacks. Japan, notably, of the G7. In addition to the Gulf states and much of the global South, Russia, Turkey. But I mean, even Russia, nominally, a strategic partner, ally of the Iranians, and getting a lot of support in drone capabilities for Russia's war in Ukraine. But the Russians aren't prepared to do anything to help the Iranians defend themselves or to join the fight against Israel. So if you're Iran right now, you have to understand that regime survival is your goal, and the likelihood of that is eroding at least somewhat on an hourly basis. And they also know that the likelihood, if they don't enter negotiations, as the Americans have demanded, and as President Trump continues to demand, that the U.S. will get directly involved in the war, and that means either providing Israel with the intelligence and the bunker buster bombs that would allow them to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities at Fordow, which is essential to the legitimacy of the regime, or the Americans would do it themselves. The likelihood of that is actually very, very high, right? Because Trump is basically saying, look, we're not entering the war, but we will if you don't engage in negotiations. So at the very least, that is what's motivating this discussion. And I think that Trump is very likely to say, yeah, okay, let's have another round of talks, and even let's have a short-term ceasefire, and assuming that the Israelis are willing to go along with that. I think the U.S. would put some pressure on Israel to make that come about, though perhaps not immediately, because Israel still has a bunch more targets they want to hit. And then we see if the Iranians are actually willing to accept no enrichment of uranium on their territory with inspections. And if that were the case, given all the damage that's just occurred, that would be a huge win for not only the Israeli prime minister, who has managed to take on his biggest adversary in a way that he's been hoping and dreaming of doing for literally decades, but also for Trump, where there would have been no damage done to the U.S. and massive damage to the Iranians. So I think that is possible. It is, of course, also possible, and I suspect quite a bit more likely, that you have another round of negotiations and they don't get to a solution, and then the Israelis and the Americans in some capacity are involved in taking out Fordow and more. Now, would that lead to regime change? And the answer there is very, very uncertain. Uncertain because it's not up to the Americans and the Israelis, it's up to how the Iranian people respond. And the regime is hated by a strong majority of the Iranian people, but that doesn't mean that the Iranian people want to see lots of Iranians get killed. The longer the war goes on, the more you're going to see civilians getting hurt and caught up in this, and it doesn't matter that they hate the regime. They're going to oppose that. There's also a greater potential of a rally around the flag effect, especially if you start seeing, the supreme leader targeted, other political leaders targeted who do have legitimacy of sorts among a decent piece of the population. And then the other question, and this is the question that's hardest to answer, is how rational will the Iranian government respond? Because, of course, the Iranians, they're not run by the supreme leader, even though he is the theocrat. Their actually policy is run by the military leadership. And, this is a leadership that has recently taken enormous hits, unprecedented hits, in the period of the Islamic Republic since 1979. And so even if the consensus view of the leadership would be not to act out of desperation, not to lash out and say, try to disrupt the Straits of Hormuz that would lead to a massive spike in oil prices and potentially a global recession. Well, what happens if the Iranians don't have the capacity to make those decisions in a thoughtful and consolidated way? What happens if a small number of military leaders who feel much more hawkish and outmaneuvered and facing targeting on a daily basis decide that they're going to go out with a bang? That's a much greater danger. What would happen if there was to be a radiological event from the nuclear capabilities that the Iranians have in Isfahan that are getting hit, for example, either as a mistake or as an intentional incident to potentially get massive outrage against the Israelis who are engaging in these strikes? I mean, that's the fog of war stuff that, of course, is very, very hard to predict. It's impossible to predict, but those things become far more thinkable, far more likely as this war is going on. And so certainly in that regard, we should all hope that cooler heads can prevail to bring a ceasefire and to allow negotiations to proceed. But we don't know that as of right now. That is not where we are, and certainly a very fast-moving conflict. That's it for me, and I'll talk to y'all real soon.